Welcome to the Sustain, Change and Grow podcast, where we discuss questions related to climate change and sustainable personal development with experts across different fields. I'm Dilara Salahova. I am currently working at the European Central Bank on sustainable finance topics, and I would like to emphasize that this podcast is not related to my work at the ECB. Instead, it is a part of my desire and effort to raise awareness about the importance of individual actions to address current environmental issues and to bring desired changes into one's life. In this episode, I'm happy to welcome Galina Hale, a professor of economics at the University of California, Santa Cruz. So Galina previously worked for more than 10 years at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and recently she had been working on ways economists can inform policymakers how to make the food system more sustainable. She serves on editorial boards of a number of economics journals and on multiple boards and committees in animal welfare and animal agriculture space. Galina, welcome, and it is such a pleasure to have you as a guest in my podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Dilara. It's looking forward to it.
So let's jump directly at the heart of the topic that you really care about. So you have been vegan for more than 5 years, right? And what motivated you to make this step?
So it's a great question, actually, and every vegan has asked that question. I've been vegetarian for probably about 15 years now, and vegan for, 6 or 7. The reason I became vegetarian is because I just started thinking, look, there are so many reasons. That's why all of us are asked, what was your reason? And there are very few reasons to not be vegetarian, right? So what are the reasons? As an economist, a lot more resources are spent on preparing animal-based meal than on preparing a plant-based meal, about 20 times, because, we feed plants to animals for a really long time, especially if you talk about cows, right, before they become food. And so we could just eat that food directly, and that takes a lot less resources and land and water and air. And so that's one reason, that's like very economist reason. Then there is environmental reason that a lot of people are aware of, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But and then of course there's health reason and animal welfare reason. So that's why I became vegetarian, because just like the pros were so much heavier than the cons. Like, why do we eat meat? Well, it tastes good. Well, I asked my doctor, like, is there any reason why I shouldn't give up meat and fish, and she said she couldn't think of any. So, and then vegan, I became, what happens is the following, and that happened to a lot of my friends as well. You stop eating animals for one of these reasons, and suppose it wasn't animal welfare, animal suffering. But after a few months, the cognitive dissonance that arises when you do eat meat, that like, I'm causing harm to animals, but it can't be that bad because I'm eating meat and I'm a good person, right? So there is a cognitive dissonance there. So like, it's okay to kill animals for food. But once that cognitive dissonance goes away, because you're no longer eating meat like for health reasons or environmental reasons, compassion for animals becomes a big part of that. And once I learned about how animals are treated in milk and egg industries, I thought I have no reason to, support those industries. And so I'm vegan. And my husband has been animal welfare guy for like 30 years. He's a founder of Humane American Foundation that founded the nonprofit adoptapet.org. He's run some other organizations prior to that, and we're both working on getting animals out of the food system, because that's the only way we think is sustainable for humanity to move forward.
Right. But so I think many people have really this impression that you can't really get as nutritious food as the meat. And also, if you don't meat, you don't get certain nutrients that are key for the human health. So do you have arguments against it?
Yes. So let me make a caveat. If you live in a society, like we still have such societies in the world where malnutrition is a big problem, animal products are the fastest solution to that problem, right? So there is a reason for survival if the calories are scarce for humans consume animals. Most of us, I live in the US, don't have this problem. The calories are available. And so, there are other issues with income inequality, but the calories are, widely available. And so there is no need to consume animals for survival. Now, in terms of specific nutrients, there are very few that you can't get from plants. And the reason for that is the animals get them from plants, right? So the cycle has to start somewhere, right? Some animals eat other animals, but eventually there is going to be an herbivore somewhere in that food chain. And those nutrients come from plants. The vitamin B12 that everyone's talking about a lot cannot be gotten from plants. However, that vitamin doesn't get depleted in the body very fast. So it's kind of like a catalyst that your body needs. And so a very occasional consumption of some animal products would get you enough of that, or you can take supplements. They're not going to be vegan supplements because the source is going to be animal, but that is a very minimal thing. And I think another thing that people kind of get stuck on is that there is this all or nothing mentality, right? So think about some other activity, like if you're recycling, right? You're supposed to be recycling. Recycling is a good thing to do, but nobody is judging you on whether there is like one piece of paper that you haven't recycled, and therefore you're not a recycler anymore, right? It's a continuum. There are people who don't recycle at all. There are people who are completely OCD about that, but like most of us are somewhere in the middle, and we try to recycle, but like if there's one piece of paper you put in the garbage, that's okay, right? For some reason with food, it's not like that, right? It is a continuum. You can have animal products for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and all the snacks, or you can be a completely vegan and not have a drop of honey or like even count yeast among the animal products, right?
Yes.
But, it's a lot better for all these different reasons to have a 90% plant-based and 10% animal-based diet. Like if you're worried about some nutrients, well, just reduce the animal food consumption. You don't have to eliminate it. When I talk to people about, the need for alternative proteins and things like that, it's a lot easier to convince everybody to reduce their meat consumption by 10% than to convince 10% of population to give up meat completely. But the impact on the industry is the same.
Yeah, right.
So it's a continuum. And a final thing, like I always hear, like I'm a triathlete. It's just my
sorry, yeah, what? Yeah, what? Sorry.
I'm a triathlete. I do triathlons.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
I've done an Ironman on a plant-based diet. That's one of my 5 bikes over there. People ask, where do you get protein? Because you need protein, and the thing is, like, I get protein from everywhere. The cow gets protein from plants. Our cousin primates, they get protein from plants. The gorilla's diet is 99% plant-based, and then they eat some bugs. And doesn't stop them from building muscle.
Okay, yeah, I think one of the difficulties for people to give up meat is the cultural. So for many cultures, meat is a big element in the culture. And so all these dishes, national dishes, they are meat-based. And so giving up meat is like giving up part of your culture. And I think it's difficult for people to imagine that. But yeah. I like your approach, like at least giving up 10% of your meat. Don't eat meat for breakfast, that's already a good start.
Yeah, and I would also don't eat dairy milk, because for the environment, dairy and cheese is really terrible, because, you know, the cows do produce a lot of methane. Methane is very potent greenhouse gas, and it takes a lot of milk to make cheese. And we have such wonderful, tasty alternatives in the market right now that, you know, I want to encourage everybody to try. They're really good.
So I think we will get to this point when we'll talk about the alternatives. So, but maybe first, just to mention, so you mentioned the bad treatment of animals, particularly for milk and eggs, so which encouraged you to stop eating these two. So can you expand a little bit on this?
Yeah, I also want to make a comment on like a cultural thing, because I'm from Russia. And Russia is a very meat and dairy heavy, you know, culture. My mom lives near me, and so whenever I go to her place, if she wants to cook something for me, I wouldn't eat anything not vegetarian, but you know, if she makes pancakes, you know, with eggs and kefir, I'll have them. I don't want to insult my mom, and it's too difficult for her to like adhere to my standards. So that's my cheat. That's where I get my B12. But yeah, like I think if you don't think about it all or nothing, you know, whenever you have a family gathering, you know, you know, be a family. It's all right. Now, to your other question about what happens, I don't even like to talk about that, because it's really kind of horrible. Like, I hope none of the viewers are like having a meal while watching this podcast, because this is not an appetizing story. You know, like a lot of people still have an image of, you know, I would say pre-World War II farming, when you have a range with the cows, you milk the cows are happy, you know, what's wrong with that? You know, you have the chickens running around, they lay eggs, you go pick up eggs, what's wrong with that? Chickens lay eggs all the time, that's what they do.
With all this, sorry to cut you, but it reminded me about this publicity about milk chocolate, you know, these happy cows in the Swiss Alps going around.
Right. Hey, look, and if you're in Switzerland, they actually have very strong animal welfare laws, which is why animal products are very expensive in Switzerland. So look, if you're in Switzerland, maybe it's okay, unless the stuff is imported from Germany or France, where it's not. So I know more a little bit about the US. And so let's think about the dairy cows. Those are treated, in fact, a lot worse than meat cows, because they're stuck in a very small crate for their entire life. They're milked by the machine. You know, if you're women listening, if you know have children and you use the breast pump, the machines that you use on cows are not that nice. And they can't even move much. And so that's their life. Before that, you know, for them to start producing milk, they need to give birth, right? So they get artificially inseminated. Then they give birth, then the baby gets taken away from them nearly immediately. And if you read some studies that, you know, some animals, even mammals, they would give birth and just leave the baby and go away. But cows are not one of those. Cows are kind of like us. They like to stay and, you know, give milk to their baby, and they have bonding, and they experience depression when their baby gets taken away. And so that's not very nice. Yeah. And then what happens to the baby? The baby is veal. So that's where you get veal. So yeah, so
very unhappy milk and veal that we consume.
Yeah, and I, you know, on kind of like spiritual, oh, I got like goosebumps. On a spiritual level, like if there is so much suffering going into your food, you know, like I'm concerned about that. Like I'm concerned whether the amount of violence in our society is related to how much violence we're consuming in our food. You know, I know it's a bit metaphysical, but like I really believe this.
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't know it. That's why we have the ag-gag laws, right? Like in the US, free speech does not extend to talking about, you cannot go with a video camera and to an agricultural facility.
Really? Why?
Yeah, no, that's why PETA, people who are trying to do it in PETA, they regularly get into jail. There's a law that says you cannot broadcast what's going on inside of the animal farming. Like, red light, no, like, you clearly have something to hide.
Yeah, so absurd.
Okay, so now eggs. There are a lot of laws. California just passed a law on air crate size for chickens. So there's a big movement around the world to get companies that provide catering and like hospitality chains to commit to only buying cage-free eggs, so that at least the hens can roam around. So this is all great. Because the cages are so small, the hens can't turn around. And, there were some laws passed in some states trying to increase the cage size, which of course increases the cost of their production, right? Because now in the same warehouse, you can have fewer hens. So I remember I bought a dozen of eggs for my mom. It was really expensive, from Texas farm that like had all these things on the label saying they're happy hens, they're free range, they have a ton of space to wander around. So I called them, actually. I called them and I said, okay, there's one problem with egg farming. When the hens lay eggs, the ones we usually eat, those are unfertilized. But if you're running a farm, you want to propagate your hens, right? So some eggs get fertilized, but as far as I know, nobody is doing any kind of genetic manipulation. And so just like with us, there is a 50-50 chance that the chick that comes out is going to be male, which is pretty much useless to the egg operation. You need a couple of roosters to fertilize those eggs, but mostly they're not needed. And so when I called this Texas farm, I asked them, what do you do with the male chicks? Because if you're saying you're also humane, like, I want to know what happens. And ready for this? They just said, well, we sell them. So what does industry do with male chicks? They actually put them live on a conveyor belt, and they get ground into animal meal, whatever, some food that they might feed back to the chickens. So yeah, no eggs.
So what about these labels, bio-organic? Do they care about the animal welfare?
I don't know if they care or not, but organic is completely kind of orthogonal to all of this, right? Because you can have animals in cages and you can feed them organic hay, that's okay. Organic,
So it's not about the quality of the animal living.
No, that's just about whether there are, chemical like pesticides and fertilizers in the animal feed, okay. Which is still, like, from environmental point of view, very important, because a lot of, so nitrous oxide is another greenhouse gas that is super potent, almost 300 times as potent as CO2. And that comes from putting nitrates as a fertilizer in the soil. Mm-hmm. And then, the evaporation from the soil then puts the gas in the atmosphere. And also producing those fertilizers is causing a lot of CO2 emissions from, like, whatever, I'm not a chemist, so like some chemical processes in addition to energy use. And so because we can put more fertilizers in animal feed than in the human food from, like, all the regulations, a lot of that comes from, that would not be organic though, right? So if you have organic stuff, environmental impact is going to be less because of nitrous oxide. But if we're talking about dairy or beef, there's going to be still methane, and all. Methane is about 30 times as potent as CO2. So it's still a lot of that. But organic is better, but it's not about animal welfare.
Okay, and now let us move forward. And actually, you have already touched upon this, and maybe now you can expand a bit more on how agriculture contributes to the climate change. Mm-hmm. So you already mentioned these fertilizers. What else?
Also, there are quite a few reports actually now coming from like UN, for example, and the US Environmental Protection Agency has a publication. So there is a recognition of the importance of agricultural sector. So the UN says, even if we cut CO2 emissions like as fast as we can dream about, I wouldn't even say as possible, because I'm not sure it's even possible. If we cut them to zero really quickly, we still can't get to Paris goals of 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade warming if we don't change the food system. So that is pretty powerful. I've seen different estimates. So I would say between 16 and 26% of all greenhouse gas emissions, if you convert them to CO2 equivalent, come from the food system. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, and most of that is animal agriculture. If you look at the, beef by far is the biggest contributor. And, people try to, most people are trying to make some efforts to reduce their impact. And so a lot of people say, well, I'm going to buy local, and this is a great idea because it's less transportation. However, if you look at the proportion of greenhouse gas contributions from the food that's due to transportation, that's tiny, especially for industries, especially like beef and dairy, any kind of cattle and dairy. These are the biggest offenders. So what are the sources? First source, deforestation. We know that the trees are capturing CO2 from the atmosphere. I frequently think about that. Like if you go to Scotland or New Zealand, right, you have those rolling hills with like little grass, pasture area, very like something we've learned to think as beautiful. That is land that has been deforested by grazing, right? That's where before humans came with their cattle, there was a forest, okay? And it's just, and the problem with this pasture land is that it basically, so not only you remove the trees that are a CO2 sink, you now pretty much the land gets depleted by cattle grazing. And when the soil gets depleted, it doesn't capture carbon either. So normally like a good fertile soil, it would also capture carbon from the atmosphere. But there's like some bacteria there, biome in the soil does that. But when the soil is depleted, there is no biome. That's why frequently, if you had a pasture, you can't really use it for like growing lettuce. Nothing is really going to grow. And people talk about regenerative agriculture. We're going to use that cow's manure to fertilize the land. That works to some extent, but there is more than manure that's needed to be put back in the soil. So there is that. There's a huge amount of water that cattle and dairy farming are using. Like I live in California, water is a big deal. And people were saying, look, we need to get rid of all these almond trees because almonds drink a lot of water, and you shouldn't drink almond milk because it's very heavy on water use. And that's true among other plant-based milks, but dairy milk takes 20 times more water than almond milk. So there's a different scale there. So there's water, there is obviously greenhouse gas emissions from the actual production, from the fertilizers. There is water pollution, especially from like chicken farms, actually, like not the egg farms, but the poultry chicken farms. Those are just terrible. You can find some videos on YouTube. The reason chicken is so cheap is because you can cram many chickens into a warehouse, and
yeah, right. Would fish be a solution?
Okay, so not wild fish, because we pretty much caught almost all of it. And actually, like, you would never think that fish has anything to do, or like marine life has anything to do with greenhouse gases. But I just learned that one of the best carbon sinks are the whales. The whales live long life. They consume a lot of carbon because, you know, those marine creatures, they kind of breathe in carbon, whatever, I don't know. And they're like plants. And when they die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean. So that's and they're big. And so that's a lot of carbon that just goes to the bottom of the ocean where it belongs, and thankfully, whale population is slowly recovering from like the time when we were killing whales en masse about 100 years ago. Their lifespan's kind of like ours, so it takes a few generations to recover. So catching a lot of, so whales don't eat fish, they eat krill. But I'm a little bit worried, I'm a lot worried that like catching pretty much all the fish is going to really, I don't know what's going to do to the biological balance of the global oceans. Like, apart from, they're beautiful and, they should be left alone. Okay, so
actually,
so the
ocean is also, I learned, absorbs 25% of the carbon dioxide from the air.
right.
And so debalancing or unbalancing the ocean wildlife, I imagine should have a significant impact on this absorption capacity.
Yeah, I think so. And the ocean is warming already, which is already threatening a lot of species, including whales, because a lot of the stuff they eat grows under the ice, and that ice is shrinking. And we're also getting all that, we're harvesting a lot of the stuff that whales eat for omega-3 pills that are very popular. So
right.
Anyway, so there is a wild thing, which is basically a finite resource, right? And then there is aquaculture. And people are pretty excited about aquaculture. You basically build giant tanks, either completely on land, like there are some fish farms in Texas, or you just fence off, a shoreline and you grow your shrimp there or whatever, or fish, like in, I think in the UK, they have those kind of ocean adjacent, and in Canada, ocean adjacent farms. So ocean adjacent farms are very dangerous because whatever is done in terms of, growth hormones or whatever, to the farmed fish, if the fish escapes in the wild, that can have effect on the wild population, and that there were already cases. And you put antibiotics in the water or whatnot because of the high density of the farm fish, and those leach into the ocean, is just increasing, the antibiotic resistance, which is a big problem, right, for us.
Indeed. The same for the meat growth, right? So
the same, yeah. No, there are a lot, we couldn't list all possible harmful effects. But then so people would say, okay, well, then you should grow fish on land. That takes a lot of water. And then also, what do you feed that fish, right? So, you need to get some krill in the ocean, ship it to your land farm. So it just doesn't sound like a very efficient production. It does happen. There is one grant that some of my colleagues at UC Santa Cruz got to figure out if they can grow fish in a tank and feed them algae and use the water, either the water from the tank that goes to, water the fields, or vice versa. I don't remember. So somehow use the water at least twice. So it's better, but it's not ideal. So, it's, yeah.
Have you heard about aquaponic culture? So for preparing to this episode, I listened to some other videos, watched the videos. And so there is this aquaponic culture, and the video was talking about a place in Berlin where they're growing fish in the middle of Berlin. And the idea is that you have some plants. So you feed the plants with the products of the fish life. So the plants use it as fertilizers, they grow, but then somehow then it's fed back to the fish. Or maybe they clean the water, and the clean water is used back to fish. So, and somehow it's promoted like a sustainable way of growing fish and also plant.
Maybe, I don't know. It's interesting, but one thing that people don't know, like people who work, on animal suffering, they frequently measure things in days of suffering, right? And so for chickens, poultry chickens, all their life is suffering, but they're slaughtered after about 2 or 3 months because they grow super fast, like they're fed all these growth hormones and stuff. Fish could live up to 2 years before it's fished out. So to your point, like, it doesn't sound like it's a very efficient way of producing fish. Fine, you can have a tank with fish that people can look at, and it's beautiful, and it helps fertilize the plants. But, the fish takes a long time to grow. So like, if you can't catch it and kill it to eat for 2 years, that is not very much fish that you're going to be producing that way.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't sound like it's a solution to global protein problem, right? But it could be fun.
Okay.
But we don't have to kill the fish, keep the fish. Same with cows. You want manure? Have the cow, have the pet cow to fertilize your garden. You don't have to kill it.
Yeah, no, that's true. And that's how I remember the cows to be. So like you would go in the village and you see these cows and their hosts, masters, they treat them very well and they're like pets. And sometimes they give milk and it's so nice. And that's how I remembered it since then. But,
yeah, me too. The cows had names and you would recognize them, when they come home. Yeah.
The life changed since then. So now moving to your other activities. So you serve on multiple boards of NGOs involved in animal agriculture space. So can you tell me, so what these NGOs do and what is your role there?
So one advisory board I joined recently is basically a research group. It's led by Bodo Steiner from University of Helsinki, I think. It's called Making Agricultural Trade Sustainable. So it's a group of people, a lot of them go to less developed countries and, try to, different interventions and trying to learn of how to make agricultural trade, sustainable in terms of food availability for those farmers, but also in terms of, global warming and things like that. So that's a group I just joined. It's a pretty large group. I'm still trying to figure out what I can contribute. Maybe some analysis of, what are the impacts. And so my thinking is the following. It kind of goes away from the animal question, but there are other greenhouse gas offenders that also kind of related to those issues. So think about chocolate, right? So chocolate is a huge contributor to greenhouse gases, and that's mostly because of deforestation, soil depletion, and transportation. And then there's also a lot of energy is used to convert cocoa beans into chocolate that we buy in the store. The bigger problem with chocolate, though, is the farmers that grow cocoa beans are being paid very little for their product, right? Because their product is, they don't have any market power. The price is pretty much set by the industry. And
by big corporations.
Big corporations, right? And it's come to the point where basically they're being paid below subsistence. But they own this land that they could farm for their own food and be at or above subsistence. The problem is because they're paid so little, they have no savings. And they cannot, when you transition from one crop to another, there is a big expense for like 1 year or two, because you need to tear up all these trees and you need to like plow the land and fertilize and let it fallow because it's been depleted. And then like after 2 years, you can start planting stuff to eat. They have no funds for those 2 years, right? And that's where NGOs come in to like help with this transition. But if you think about, as an economist, think about net present value of the future stream of what the land can produce if it's farmed sustainably, that number is larger than business as usual, right? It's just the path has this dip in the beginning. And in fact, that's like any business project, right? So this is something a bank should be willing to fund, right? But we need a proof of concept, right? We need to be able to show, look, this farm did transition with NGO money, and look, now they're making profit every year. If you can take that to the bank and say, look, I want to do the same thing this farm did, give me a loan because I'm going to be good for it, because once I start planting tomatoes, I'm going to make a killing. And so we need to gather this kind of data to show to finance, because NGOs, there are a lot of them, but their resources are very limited. And in order to make big changes, you need like mainstream financial system to be part of it. And so that's what I'm trying to figure out. And that also applies to animal to plant transition in the US, for example. So US farmers, small farmers are not doing much better, right? So when we talk to politicians about, look, we need to have alternative proteins or not, their question they ask, what do I tell my rangers, right? Like their family, they've been raising cows for meat for like, 5 generations. Like, what do I tell them? And they also don't make a ton of money for this because they compete against industrial farming, right?
Yes. And
they don't have a lot of savings. And if I say, well, reduce the size of your land on which you graze your cows, use the other part of your land to grow peas, they say, well, I'm going to need the machinery. I'm going to need to learn how to grow peas. I don't have any money for investment on this. And there are now organizations that are trying to bridge this gap. And at the same time, I'm trying to make sure they collect the data, because then I can take this data to the bank and say, you need to give a loan to this farmer to transition from being a dairy farmer to being an oat farmer, so we can make oat milk.
Right. No, that sounds really interesting and very useful. Is what we need. One problem I imagine with the African countries is also maybe political stability. This is very different for the US. For the US, you need just to show the proof of concept that this will work and the demand will follow. Maybe for African countries, it may be a bit different.
Yeah, well, so for African countries, the issue of demand is not necessarily even an issue, because people can grow food for their own family on that land, right? Mm. For the US, what people who are doing work on this do, they supply the farm with a contract on purchasing the plant materials they're gonna grow. So I don't know if you know Miyoko, I can never remember her last name, but she makes cheese and butter. It's called Miyoko's. Mm-hmm. So initially she was making these products from coconut oil and cashews. These are very good for making cheese. Her stuff is really good. But then, because of this stuff needs to be shipped from Asia, she tried to come up with a formula that would use local produce. Her factories in Northern California. And, so what's produced, what can you grow? You can't grow cashew and coconuts here, but you can grow oats and potatoes. And so she's come up with a formula for cheese that's using oats and potatoes. And then she actually engaged local farmers in that transition process with a guarantee that she's going to purchase oats and potatoes from them. And they can keep their portion of their herd, obviously, but just a smaller portion, use the manure from that herd to fertilize their plants. but use a portion of their land. And over time, they're going to see that the portion of the land that's used for plants is actually bringing them more money and is more, it doesn't get depleted. Like you can actually see like all this cracked soil, like with nothing on it. That's the pasture, right? So it's not, like in a drought land like this, the pasture is not a pretty sight. It's not Switzerland. I mean, not Scotland, but yeah. So she's doing this, and if you give a purchase contract, that gives them security for getting the income as long as they can actually grow the stuff.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting example. And so, because you already mentioned it, these innovative products. So maybe you can speak a bit more about it. So, like, what are the options? Because I will give you my, just let me share an anecdote, like my experience with what I see as vegan food in the supermarkets. I think it makes more harm than good. So, and it's really full of, I think, very bad ingredients. I don't know what they put inside. It may be vegan, but it's really not good. So, and can we really make a good cheese, which tastes good out of vegan products? So, like
yes. Try Violife feta. It's made in Greece. So here a couple of comments I have on this. One is nobody eats cheese for its health benefits. Cheese is bad for you. Like dairy cheese is bad for you. It's full of cholesterol, sodium, and fat, right? That's pretty much what it's made of.
It has calcium. So it has
a little calcium. You can add calcium to a vegan cheese. Calcium is chalk, right? That's what, that's why some kids at school, they eat chalk because they're calcium deficient. Mm-hmm. So calcium is no problem at all. But like, eating a lot of cheese is not going to make you a healthy person. So for health purposes, don't eat cheese. But some people want to eat cheese because it's yummy and addictive. There was like somebody got a Nobel Prize for showing that there is a substance in the cheese that is actually triggering the addiction centers in the brain. Yeah, so cheese is addictive. So if you can have vegan one, it has better impact on the environment, probably not good for your health either, because what it has like starch and fat, right? That, it would have like some starch and some fat, usually coconut, and that has saturated fat, just like dairy milk, because it's solid at the room temperature. If you want to put a different oil, you need to hydrogenate it to have it at the solid at the room temperature, and that's not healthy either. So now burgers, nobody eats burgers for health reasons, right? Like you don't think I'm going to go to McDonald's because I want to have a healthy diet and I'm going to have a cheeseburger, right? So the reason, so I think like kind of envision the world once we have transitioned to like a good sustainable world, people eat plant-based diet, it's going to be whole food plant-based. There's not going to be any need for the burgers. But there are traditions, you have your 4th of July barbecue, you got to grill some burgers. People want burgers. It's convenient. Occasionally I grill at an Impossible or a Beyond or something like that. It's not healthy. It doesn't make my belly feel good. But like we do it, every, 6 months maybe or something. We have a little barbecue in the yard. So that's one point. Another point is labeling, right? So whenever something is manufactured in a plant, like your plant-based burger, you have to list every ingredient that you put in there, okay? But if you've slaughtered a cow, you do not have to report every ingredient that went into the cow, right? Yeah. And so in fact, I will send you a link later, or you can find it on our nonprofit foodsysteminnovation.org. We have resources page, fsi.org. Resource page, there is an infographic that lists all the ingredients at the same level of chemical detail for a beef burger. It's a very long list, and it might include salmonella, and it does include cholesterol, but none of these things need to be listed because the cow has combined them for you. So So if you start thinking about like animal is a technology for transforming plants into protein, and if you put the same requirements, you're going to have, banana has a lot of ingredients, and a banana is healthy. But if you put everything at the same chemical, if we were to synthesize the exact banana and would have to report all the ingredients that went into it, it's a long list of ingredients, most of which you can't pronounce because you don't have a chemistry PhD. And, so I think it's a bit of comparing apples to oranges when we read the labels. Because of label requirements, they are favoring animal industry in that way.
Right. So actually it made me think about this book, which is called Parfumer. So, where he made the people smell like the ingredients which he put it. So it became like, it feels, when you read it, it feels so disgusting. And so here, when you think of all the ingredients that go into certain food that we consider as yummy and that we want to have, well, finally, it's not either good, or it's more of a habit and a pleasure than really healthy food, right? So
yeah, it's a little, it's all acquired taste. There is a reason we have this expression, it's an acquired taste. For example, in the US especially, people are very much addicted to sugar, right? Everything is super sugary. Ketchup has a lot of sugar in it. Yeah. And it's not even dessert.
The US food for normal European, I think it's uneatable. Like, it's so sweet, and the desserts is the worst of everything. So
yeah, and it's funny. Like, I have berries growing in my yard. They're called Oregon grape, but it's a form of barberries. They're blue. They're a little bit sour. I love them. My mom loves them. My husband can't eat them. Like, they're too tart.
So, well, we have only a few minutes. So, and I'm thinking, let me ask you the last question very quickly. So, you're a professor in the University of California, Santa Cruz, a director of the CEBRA IFM program, and the co-director of the UCSC Center of Analytical Finance. So how do you translate your engagement in fighting climate change in the educational process?
So, yeah, it's a great question. And it's kind of something I'm trying to convince everybody. Like, if you want to help the climate change solutions, just think a little bit about how you can incorporate anything you can do about that into your job, like every day, not just everyday personal life, like recycle, use less water, whatever, but in your job, because that's where we spend most of our waking time. So teaching wise, I basically, no matter what the name of the class I teach, I talk about climate change in that class. It's always relevant because climate change poses financial risks. Most classes I teach have to do with finance. And the students really respond because they are the generation that is going to have to live with the consequences of what we do now. So that is a kind of actually an easy part. And I'm pivoting a lot of my research towards climate change related topics, both on climate finance, but also on food system sustainability. Me and my colleague, we just got a grant from USDA, US Department of Agriculture, to put together a database of all state level policies that relate to agriculture directly or indirectly, intentionally or unintentionally. Like, immigration policies affect cost of fresh produce. So, and then codify all this legislation by crop and commodity to see what is being favored by state policies. So it's a big 4-year project that would allow further research into how are the legislation changing the balance, for example, between plants and animals that are produced in their state.
Very interesting. And you mentioned that the youth is very responsive Is it reflected in their personal actions, in the choice of what they want to do as work? How do you see it?
Oh, I think so, yes. So a number of students have contacted me and asked me if I know of any jobs they can take that would be, either related to alternative proteins or to any kind of climate finance. We're here near Silicon Valley, any technology. I had a professor from a chemistry department give a lecture to my students about CO2 capture technologies. I had a professor from coastal science department talk about climate change. The coastal destruction mitigation measures that you can plant corals and mangroves, which have an additional benefit of capturing CO2 to protect the coastline. So I'm trying to, because you see in young people, you see a lot of despair actually about climate, right? Like,
really,
our parents, grandparents messed it up for us. Now the world is dying, and like it's just nothing but to get depressed about that. And I'm trying to like change that fear into can do kind of attitude, like despair is not going to help anybody. So trying to show that, look, there are solutions, they are being implemented, there are a lot of smart people thinking about these issues, and if we just I feel like I can maybe help combine the smart people that think of solutions with other smart people who happen to have made a lot of money in tech in Silicon Valley that could fund the implementation of these solutions, maybe can make progress quicker than it's happening otherwise. But the progress is happening, so it's, I think we are in a grave danger right now and kind of at the pivotal moment in, human history. But I think we have a good way out still, it's not quite too late yet.
We just have to move faster.
You've got to move faster than it's happening on its own, right? You can't count on politicians to move fast enough. They have too many constraints.
Yeah.
So just, do the right things. And there are so many, like I ran into a young man who is working on getting people collect spare change, either probably not in physical form, but like in a, when you Google Pay or Apple Pay like $3.50 for whatever, get the 50 cents into like a separate bank. And then he would collect that across thousands of people and make investment in climate mitigation solutions, which actually has a good return on investment. And that way your 50 cents from your coffee cup will turn into $50 over the next 5 years,
Yeah. And for students, so I would say acting is the easiest way to feel empowered. So like as soon as they start acting, they feel the agency and that things depend on them. And the last two questions. So really, do you think that climate change topics has well penetrated in the university and school programs, or is there anything like we should do more? So to educate.
We should do more. I've been talking to some of my colleagues to maybe create like a freshman class that would cover like different aspects of climate change. Like I can talk about economic aspects. Somebody can talk about biological aspects, the chemical. Like I'm in a big school, so I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to implement this, but I think we might do it. Like a bunch of senior faculty who don't care about like getting extra credit or something. We can do that.
I think that's a really good idea. And finally, so what are your two most inspiring books? That's the question I ask every guest. So,
okay, good. And you emailed me, so I had a chance to prepare. No, I thought about that. I read a lot. I actually do a lot of Audible these days because I figure I work with my eyes all day long, so I need to give them a break. But some years ago, maybe like 15 or 20 years ago, I read Thomas Merton, Seven-Story Mountain. That's a nonfiction. It's kind of like a biography. Thomas Merton was a Trappist monk. at the end of the book or when he wrote the book. But he didn't start that way. He didn't even start as a Catholic. So that was very interesting. I'm Catholic. Another is gonna have, I love so many books, but I just read Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy. So it starts with Crake and Oryx, and then The Year of Flood, and then Mad Adam, the story of Toby. It's a dystopia, and it's about, if we do nothing about climate change, we're kind of going to be in her story. It's not pretty, but there is a lot of human goodness in that, and not eating animals is there's a big part of that human goodness. So. And one that just for literary, I read like about a year ago, All the Light We Cannot See by Andrew Doerr.
That's a beautiful one.
Oh, such a beautiful book. I was in tears for like so many hours.
Thank you very much, Galina. That was super interesting.
That was a lot of fun. Thank you for doing this important work. And, maybe we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely. There are still a lot of questions that I wanted to ask and we didn't have time. So we should...
Well, we need to have a sequel.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.